What is the feudal system? It's when a king gives some of his power to nobles in exchange for their loyalty. Alright, that's basic. Let's go back to medieval Europe around 800 AD. The Roman Empire has fallen, and a new system of government is needed. Enter feudalism. Feudalism was a way of organizing society that began in medieval Europe and lasted until the modern era. In this system, a king would grant land to nobles in exchange for their loyalty and military service. The nobles then had the right to use the land as they saw fit, often granting portions of it to knights in exchange for their loyalty and military service, and the knights in turn might grant portions of their land to peasants or serfs, who would work the land and pay rent in the form of labor or a portion of their crops. But why do we need all of these middlemen? Couldn't the king just hire soldiers like we have today? Well, yes, but this was the best system they had at the time. Remember, there's no standing army yet. The king could not depend on his nobles to fight for him unless he paid them, and he didn't have enough money to do so. So instead, the king gave his nobles land that they could keep as long as they remained loyal, and gave the king military service when asked. The king also expected the nobles to govern and administer justice in their regions. They were also responsible for building and maintaining any fortifications in their region, such as castles. These fortifications were necessary because during this time period, warfare was common and raids and invasions were frequent. The nobles were then granted rights to collect taxes from the peasants in exchange for protection. But wait, if the king didn't have any money and the nobles didn't have to pay the king anything, how did the king get money? This is where things get kind of squirrely. The king didn't really have the right to tax his people. The power had been transferred to the nobles when the king gave them the land. But since the peasants farmed the land and were working the land for the noble, they could demand a portion of what the peasants produced. This was usually in the form of rent, which could be paid in money, crops, or labor. The peasants were required to work the land for a portion of the year, usually around 3 days a week. They also had to give the noble a portion of what they produced, usually around 1/10 of their crops. On top of this, they had to pay a fee if they wanted to use the noble's mill, press, or oven. And if they were caught stealing from the noble or trespassing on their land, they were severely punished, sometimes with fines, sometimes with imprisonment, and sometimes with exile or even death. In addition to collecting taxes, the nobles also had the right to judge the peasants in their courts. This meant that they could decide whether or not someone was guilty of a crime and what punishment they should receive. Sometimes the punishments were harsh, such as exile or even execution, but nobles were expected to rule fairly and justly. So what was life like under the feudal system? Well, that depended on your social class. If you were a peasant, life was probably pretty hard. You would work long hours for little pay, and you would have to obey the rules of your lord. However, you would also have the security of knowing that your lord would protect you from harm. If you were a knight, you would have more freedom than a peasant, but you would also have more responsibilities. You would be expected to fight in the king's army when called upon, and you would have to defend your lord's lands from attack. As a noble, you would have the most power and privilege, but you would also have the most enemies. You would be constantly vying for more power and wealth, and you would have to be careful not to make too many enemies. Anyway, as the Middle Ages progressed, the feudal system began to decline. The power of the kings increased, and the power of the nobles decreased. Eventually, the feudal system was replaced by the modern system of government. Today, feudalism is no longer a way of organizing society, but its legacy can still be seen in some parts of the world. For example, in Japan, the shogun was the supreme military commander, and the daimyo were the lesser lords who owed military service to the shogun. This system is similar to the feudal system in medieval Europe. That's the feudal system in a nutshell. The king gives some of his power to nobles in exchange for their loyalty and service. The nobles then had the right to use the land as they saw fit and collect taxes from the peasants. Life under the feudal system was hard for most people, but it was necessary in order to keep society functioning. Today, feudalism is no longer a way of organizing society, but its legacy can still be seen in some parts of the world.